So having him here today is very important and critical for us because as we begin to share the story and spend this month of Black History Month of Boone Hall Plantation, when you go back there and you take a look at one of the panels, you'll see that there's a panel back there that the Professor Damon Fordham wrote. So I'm really privileged to have that panel up there. And what he does is he outlined Boone Hall Plantation and when John Boone purchased it and all the way down. So on the panel back there, I proudly have his name up there. And so that's his information and not mine, ours. So if you got any questions about it, he's the one you can ask. So I want to thank each of you that's here right now. And the next voice we hear is none other than the Professor Damon Fordham. Damon, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Summertime, but what a lot of people don't know is that song has its origins right here in Charleston with a real-life African-American street beggar by the name of Samuel Smalls, who in 1924 got in an altercation with a lady by the name of Maggie Barnes on number 4 Romney Street, uptown. And he was arrested for this, and the Charleston News and Courier had a headline that said, "Cripple arrested for firing at woman." You know, back when they had all that sensitivity and political correctness. And so a man by the name of Du Bois Hayward read the story and said, "Hey, I know this guy." And he wrote a novel called Porgy in 1925. 7 years later, the great jazzman George Gershwin read it in New York and said, "This is really good stuff," and came down here and collaborated with Du Bois Hayward to make the great Broadway show Porgy and Bess. Samuel Smalls died in 1925, shortly after he was released from jail because of the illness that he received from the poor condition of the jail that he was in at the time. But however, in recent years, the connection has been made to that story, and I wrote about this in a book called True Stories of Black South Carolina. Now, that goes to show the many untold stories that are of this area that never made the history books. And I'm going to talk about that plus my connection to this plantation and how all of this got to be how it was to begin with. Our story begins back in 1502 when Columbus was on his third voyage to what we now call the Dominican Republic. He brought with him a Spanish priest named Padre Bartolomé de Casas. And Columbus was enslaving the Native Americans of the region. And Father Bartolomé was horrified by this and said, "This is a sin against God. Something must be done to alleviate the suffering of these people." He had a solution, all right, to go to Africa and use the blacks instead. And in 1527, he wrote in his Historia de las Indias that he begged God to forgive him for his error due unto ignorance. And incidentally, if you would like to record this, I'm very good with that. Go right ahead and record because these are things that your kids aren't going to usually hear in school. Mm-hmm. So, one of the places that they chose in West Africa for this was Gorée Island off the coast of what is now known as Senegal. Because you see in West Africa, they had what was called the Songhay Empire, which is modern day from about where Senegal is to the upper parts of the Congo on the west coast. And they had a king named Askia Muhammad, who was a very intelligent and wise king. But, you know, the old folks have a saying that smart parents make lazy children. So he had these 3 trifling sons who overthrew him when the old king went blind. And they spent the next 30 years fighting over the kingdom until the Moroccan leader, Sultan Al-Mansur, then took over the Songhai kingdom with the confusion going on. And one of the things he did was take the wise men of the region and either imprison them or execute them, cut off the head, and the body will die. So all of these things combined to make the transcontinental slave trade. And they picked an island off the coast of Senegal called Gorée Island, where I visited twice over the last couple of summers. And that's where you had what's called the door of no return. Now this is a very fascinating place. Anybody here been there? Okay, well, let me tell you what it's like. You get off the boat on Gorée Island, and they beat the drums and have praise singers and so forth welcoming you there. And they take you on this little roadway to the, and I know my French is not good, Maison des Esclaves, the house of slaves. And one of the places that you pass by is a place called the Le Maison des Café au lait. Anybody here know what café au lait means in French? It's a coffee mixed with milk. And in French, they use café au lait as a sort of euphemism for light-skinned black woman. You know how, like Patti LaBelle, when she was singing Lady Marmalade about the café of coffee, or color of café au lait, that's what they were talking about. In the Maison de Café au lait, that is where the enslavers would go into the pens in which they captured the Africans, and the children that they would have from the African women, the girl children, they would have them in the Maison de Café au lait so that they could be purchased by the slavers as concubines. So anyway, you go past that, and then you go into Les Maisons des Esclaves, and you see all these pens and dungeons where they enslave people. And let me tell you something. It is a very powerful experience. There are pictures of from when Nelson Mandela was there, President Obama, Michael Jackson, a couple of the popes, President Bush Jr. and Clinton and so forth. And then you walk through what is called the door of no return. And that's where things really get powerful, because that is the plank where they would walk them onto the slave ships. Now, I'll tell you, if you can walk through there with dry eyes, I'm scared of you. Because that's a powerful place. And the second time I went, I was with one of two people who were there before. So I was very concerned about this group, being it was their first time there. So one of them, a young lady named Phyllis Holmes, who's probably watching this now, I went to Phyllis after we came back, when we were finished with all this, and I said, Phyllis, tell me how you're feeling. And Phyllis told me these words. She said, Damon, I'm going to tell you, all my life, I wondered what our foreparents saw, what they smelled, what they experienced as they were being marched onto those slave ships. And now that I have seen what they have seen and walked where they have walked, right now I can tell you I feel closure and I feel whole. And I said, Phyllis, you literally just took the words right out of my mouth. Powerful experience. So on this side of things, you had for a while the enslavement of the Native Americans and so forth. But what happened here was as follows. In 1526, up in what we now call Georgetown, you had Captain Juan Lucas Vasquez de Alva, Spaniard. Because, see, the Spanish colonized America before the British. A lot of people don't know that. And he brought with him a boatload of Africans as well as Spaniards. And he named what we now call Georgetown as the colony of San Miguel Guadalupe. But the colony of San Miguel Guadalupe was short-lived because Captain Vasquez died early in the voyage. And he left behind a dictatorial leader by the name of Gines Doncel. And Gines Doncel was so bad that one night, up in what we now call Georgetown, the Africans surrounded his hut and set it on fire with the desired results. And they ran into the interior, where they married into the Waccamaw Native American tribe. And their descendants are among the black people of Georgetown today. So not only was the Georgetown area the first to have Africans in South Carolina that we know of, that was the very first slave rebellion that we know of in what would become the United States. So 150 years later, King Charles II colonized this area. And being the humble and modest and unassuming guy that he was, named the place Charlestown. And Captain Nathaniel Sale brought a ship here called the Three Brothers that landed in what we now know as West Ashland. And among the people on the Three Brothers were three Africans who he gave the English names of John, John Jr., and Elizabeth. Needless to say, we don't know their African names. And it was 10 years after that that John Boone purchased this area for this particular plantation. And the main thing here was rice, because in Senegal and Gambia, I ate rice and fish just about every day. And rice is a major part of the diet of West Africa. And in Sierra Leone and Liberia, you continue to this day to see women sewing the baskets that they use to store and sift the rice. So from Georgetown to Brunswick, Georgia, they needed people who knew how to grow rice. So they brought those people from those areas to this area. And because these Africans were so isolated, they, for the most part, on the Sea Islands in particular, they outnumbered white people. The only white people there were plantation owners and the overseers. So they kept more of their African speech and folkways and culture than any other black people brought to the United States in this region. And they have a tribe over in Sierra Leone called the Goya tribe. And among others, they have the Kisei people. And this is believed by some to be where the term Gullah Geechee comes from. So people ask me from my trips to Africa, well, what other cultural connections did you see? Y'all brace yourself for this. One night, I was among the Mandinka people in Gambia, in a village in Gambia, West Africa. So we're out there in the jungle with the chief and the queen mother. And I'm sitting there wearing a dashiki, probably this very same one right here that I got over there. And I'm there with them in our group, and they're beating the drums and dancing and singing songs and all of that. And I just become overwhelmed with emotion at seeing something so ancestral that, and so as all this is happening, the queen mother, all of a sudden, she begins to go, wah! And for the next 5 minutes, I couldn't tell you where I was or what I was doing. Next thing I know, about 5 minutes later, I'm there sort of coming to, and the Mandinka people are clapping, and the American group that I'm with, they're laughing and patting me on the back. And I noticed that I'm no longer by where the chief and the queen mother were, but I'm on the other side where the Americans are. And so I said, what just happened here? Charles Tucker, a member of our delegation, a guy from Detroit, he comes to me and slaps me on the neck and said, Dame, all you needed just now was a tambourine in the sanctified church. And I said, what? And he said, bro, you were really putting on some moves there just now. And I later learned that I'd just gotten so caught up into the emotion of what I was watching that I just started getting, you know how they say catching the spirit around here? Well, I looked into that, and I found out that what I experienced was that in West African ceremonies, they have what's called the sa'ut, where they go into these trances and things of this sort as they are, as the music and the dancing and so forth get very emotional, right? And so that is basically the Africanized version of when black people here get the spirit when the music is going and the preaching is going and all of that, and we sort of just lose track of where we are and all of that, and catching the Holy Spirit. That, the Sa'ut of West Africa is basically the ancestor of our shout here in America. That's how deep this gets. So anyway, because of this isolation, the black people from Georgetown to Brunswick, Georgia, keep all of these African things, right? And this is where we get the Gullah and Geechee culture. And for many years, people looked down on it. My grandmother, Janie Fordham, was born in Ondo around 1900. And because she had to work in the fields as a little girl, she never had the opportunity to go to school and learn to read and write. So she spoke Gullah to her dying day in 1976 when I was 12 years old. So in 1968, when I was 4 years old, she would call me in the house by going, "Even y'all churn too trifling, y'all better come on in, y'all, before I box y'all," and things like that. So she and my grandfather would save their money so that my dad could go to South Carolina State. And Dad became the first of 3 generations of teachers in our family. I am the second, my nephew's the third, and several of his students are right here in this audience. So in those days, however, if you were the son of a teacher or somebody like that, your parents did not want you speaking Gullah because they looked down on it as being country, backward, and low class. But as you could tell, I always had a love of theatrics and mimicry. So every now and then I would deliberately make Dad furious by going, "Daddy, I'm hungry. I just want some okra soup. Stop that. I ain't sending you to school to talk like that. I went wrong, Daddy. I just want something to eat. Stop it. What are you mad? Stop what I say." So in 1932, there was Dr. Lorenzo Dow Turner. He was a black linguist from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. He came to teach at our major black college, South Carolina State in Orangeburg, my dad's alma mater. And he taught a summer school class and was shocked to hear the students down here from this area say things like, "Man, Dr. Turner, you up in your man up the window." Excuse me? "Man, Dr. Turner, he hot up in the yard, up the window? Why, what type of speech is this? I find this fascinating. This I must study." So he went throughout coastal South Carolina and Georgia studying Gullah. And in 1949, he wrote the book Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect, which is how we know the reality of the connections with Gullah and the west coast of Africa. Flash forward, 1988. General Joseph Momo of Sierra Leone, West Africa. He spoke at the Penn Center, 70 miles south of here in St. Helens Island. And he got up in front of the people and said in his native tongue, "I'm glad to see you today." And a lady in the audience who spoke Gullah replied, "Pray God, that man for talk like we." It sounds like this. So the man who was Ladi Fasidum took the people that talk like we back to Sierra Leone. And the people on both sides, just as I was, were amazed at the similarities of languages, lifestyles, and culture. So PBS went along with them and filmed a documentary that was fittingly entitled Family Across the Sea. And that's the story of Gullah. Meanwhile, here at Boone Hall, there was a couple that they bought from Flat Rock, North Carolina, named Jackson and Selena Maxwell, who they brought to work in slavery on this plantation. And according to the family lore, they left the children behind. And after emancipation, at the James Maxwell Plantation in Flat Rock, North Carolina, their son, my great-grandfather, J.B. Maxwell on my mother's side, he came along down with them in search to be reunited with the family. So they stayed here for a time being, but J.B. was a determined man. His name was James Buchanan Maxwell. He was named after the guy who was president when he was born. And he somehow managed to make it to the Avery Institute in Charleston, which was set up in 1868 as a school for the newly freed black people of Charleston. And he graduated in the first class in 1873. And in the 1880s, he became the early president of the Avery Alumni Association. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. During the period after slavery, we have something that has been largely censored from our history books called the Reconstruction era. This was the period where after the fall of slavery and after the fall of the Confederacy, the federal government tried to reform the South by passing 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th in 1865 that ended slavery throughout the country. The 14th in 1868 that said that all persons born here were citizens. And the 15th in 1870 that said all men have the right to vote. Women would get that in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Here in South, so black people were voting and setting up state governments. 1868, over at what's now the Julius Waitie's Warren Judicial Center, 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina to bring a new sense of revolutionary liberation to the state and eventually the rest of the South. They called for such things as all laws pertaining to racial discrimination would be stricken from the books. Women would be allowed to divorce abusive husbands. No one would go to jail for debt, and there would be state hospitals and mental institutions. On January 23rd, 1868, the great Robert Smalls, the man who sneaked himself and the rest of the enslaved family aboard a Confederate ship called the Planter in Charleston Harbor and off into freedom, the great Robert Smalls got up in that courtroom that day and said, "Resolved, all children in South Carolina between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance." That, ladies and gentlemen, was the first public school law ever passed in this part below the Mason-Dixon line. Along with that, you had at my alma mater, the University of South Carolina, from 1873 to 1877, there was the only desegregated school anywhere in the southern United States during Reconstruction. They had a black professor named Richard T. Greener, whose statue is now next to the library at USC. There was a black lady named Miss Celia Dial Saxton. If you hung around Columbia back in the days, you might remember the Saxon Home Projects. Well, nowadays, they have the Celia Dial Saxton Dormitory at the University of South Carolina campus. From 1870 to 1877, there were 2 black lieutenant governors of South Carolina. Alonzo Jacob Ransier from Pitt Street in Charleston, from 1870 to 1872, who was a Haitian American. Then after him, you have Richard Howard Bleaves, who served from 1872 to 1877. And by the way, Richard Howard Bleaves was lieutenant governor under Governor Franklin Jacob Moses, making this the first time in American history, or perhaps anywhere, where a municipality was run by a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor. Now, when I bring up these things to people, they often ask me this. 2 questions. Number 1, why haven't I heard any of this before? And number 2, well, what the heck happened? Here's what happened. Throughout the history of the Deep South, the wealthy class of whites who ruled the South's deepest fear was that the poor whites, in their poverty and illiteracy and subjugation, would find common cause with their black brethren and come together to create a revolution that would overthrow the rule of the wealthy class of whites. So to prevent that from happening, they indoctrinated the poor whites with the idea that if black people had equality with them, the poor whites would be placed to the bottom of society. In simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And that's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. So, 158 years ago, December 24th, 1865, 6 Confederate veterans gathered at the courthouse in Pulaski, Tennessee, to form the Resistance Army against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. You see where that went? For the next 12 years, the Southland bathed in blood. Memphis Massacre of 1866, New Orleans Massacre of 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre of 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre of 1873, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre of 1875, Hamburg, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, Elgin, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, and 148 years ago, November the 8th, 1876, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of the street of downtown Charleston over on Broad Street. That's according to the Charleston News and Courier, November the 9th, 1876. So, the federal government said, yo, it's too much. We can't handle this mess here. And on February 26, 1877, they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise that ended Reconstruction, that put the South back into the hands of the former Confederates. One aspect of this was that Mildred Rutherford out of Georgia and her organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, went on a national campaign to take things like what I just told you out of the history books and replace it with pro-Confederate history. Those books were in our schools until 1984, the year after I graduated from Wando High, knowing full well that the average person knows pretty much what they are told, and very few seek beyond that except for weirdos and bookworms like me, okay? So this is why the average person, and you too, Lorna, so this is why these things are not widely known. So, but however, this did not come without a fight. In 1895, our senior senator, Benjamin Ryan Tillman, gathered the South Carolina legislature together to follow the lead of Mississippi. And they called a session to throw out their progressive Reconstruction Constitution and replace it with the segregation Jim Crow Constitution. However, as described in my current book, The 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, 6 brave black leaders, Robert Smalls, who I just discussed, William J. Whipper, a lawyer on Broad Street, whose great-grandnephew Seth is a recently retired judge, Thomas Miller, the founding president of our black university, South Carolina State, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. These 6 brave black leaders risked their lives, faced tremendous threats and insults to go before the South Carolina legislature to argue vociferously and eloquently against the segregation constitution. They lost 116-7, but that loss planted the seeds for the civil rights movement that was to come. And let me take this closer to home. One of those people that was voting during that period was my great-grandfather, J.B. Maxwell. In 1879, they had an election here in Mount Pleasant. And the people who voted were rounded up and taken to the courthouse on Broad Street on trumped-up charges while voting while illiterate. And according to the court records found by my cousin Cheryl Washington James, who's a librarian up in St. George, a family story we heard over the years turned out to be very true. They tried the men, and a number of the men from this area did indeed turn out to vote while illiterate. But they put J.B. on the stand, the man who was educated at Avery Institute, the man who was the secretary at Sunday school at Olive Branch AME Church. And as he went on to this, they were like, well, can you read? And he said, I can read. And the lawyer was like, you can? And over he said, I can read, I can read, I can read, until the judge banged the gavel for him to get off of the stand. And for years I thought that was a family story, but it turned out in the records of the court, November 12, 1879, over at the courthouse, that story was indeed true. And so it's also in my current book, The 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, by the way. So I say all that to say that so often during this period, people think that when these terrible things happened, the people sat back and did nothing until the days of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, research shows that that's a lie. Now, back to this J.B. Maxwell. In the 30s, he was still the superintendent of Sunday school at Olive Branch. And that was during the Great Depression, when there was massive poverty and hunger throughout the place. So he ran a little grocery store over in what we now call 4 Mile. And he and my great-grandmother were raising my mother. Her parents split up in Harlem about some 15 or so years earlier, and so she and my Uncle Roy were sent down here to be raised. And the proud man that he was, he would not let my great-grandmother, Rebecca Maxwell, work. But however, most of the day he was either at the store or settling disputes for the people in the community. So needing that they needed more food on the table than that, my great-grandmother would take my young mother up here to Boone Hall with her to pick tomatoes in the afternoon to help make ends meet and try to get back to 4 Mile in time. They walked, mind you, in order to secretly make ends meet. And that is basically my connection with Boone Hall Plantation, was that my mother picked tomatoes here in the 40s. My great-great-grandparents were enslaved here. So when there was some controversy over people like me coming here to speak at a place like Boone Hall, I said, who better than somebody whose ancestors were here to get up here and tell this story? And I have a couple of final stories to wrap this up with. Now, in West Africa, they have these people that are called the griots. They are the storytellers and historians of the region. When the written word was not in West Africa, these people would train their direct descendants to pass down these stories from generation to generation. And when I was in Gambia at one point, we were in a village, and the griot was about to tell us the story of his village and the people in the village. And he took one look at me and pointed, and I asked the translator, what's this all about? He said, he wants you to come next to him. So the griot is sitting in this altar in the middle of the bush, and there's has arm seats and all that. He wants me to sit down as he is telling me that he's telling the story. So after he's through telling that, the griot and I embrace, and I said, well, what just happened here? And he said, he considers you his American counterpart. And I was like, whoa, this is deep. And then when we went to Senegal, they have what is called the baobab tree. The baobab tree is where they bury the griots. And so both times when I went there, I made it a point to go to make a pilgrimage, to go there and touch the tree in silence for a moment to these people who were sort of the forebearers of what I do now. But here's where things really get wild. Everywhere I went, and particularly in Senegal, people would say that I was of the Wolof people of that region because of my facial features and everything, right? So we were at in 2022, we were at the museum, at the Black Civilizations Museum in Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal, West Africa. And there was a young lady named Kaiba, who's probably watching this now. And she was a student at the University of Dakar who was doing the tour. And I kept looking at this girl, and she kept looking at me, right? And it was just sort of eerie. But Sekou, who was our translator, he's smiling through the whole thing. And so at the end of this, Sekou said, Professor, please come here for a moment. And I said, yeah. And so he brings Kaiba over to me and goes, Professor, this is your Wolof sister. And those of you who follow my Facebook page and follow my adventures in Africa, this girl could pass for my younger sister or daughter. Well, then it gets even better, believe it or not. It gets even better. So right before we left to come back to the United States, I was in the hotel and I looked at the computer about this Wolof tribe, right? And it turns out that it said right there, and you remember seeing this, it said on the webpage, the Wolof are the storytellers and the guardians of history of this region. I'm like, oh. Turns out that I come by this honestly. So, yeah. And I went back there over the last summer, and Kaiba was there again, and we had a really emotional meeting again. Before I went with the rest of the group, I had a few minutes alone with her, and so, we bowed and did the salam alaikums and all of that, and so when the group came in to do the tour, she said, before we give the tour, and she went over to me and said, I want my brother to stand by me as I do this tour. And, yeah. So we've stayed in touch and all of that. So earlier I told you about the documentary Family Across the Sea. Well, folks, I literally found my family across the sea. But one thing I want to close with before I get out of here is that I said before that a lot of people, when they don't want to hear about slavery, because so often they've been led to believe that all we did was suffer and sing and all of that until the days of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And that is far from true. I want to close with a story that some of you may know, but some of you may not, and that is about a man who refused to get down like that here in Charleston. His name was Denmark Vesey. Was born in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, in 1767. And he was owned by a Charlestonian named Captain Joseph Vesey. And Captain Vesey needed somebody to do the paperwork for the plantation. So they taught Denmark how to read. And he lived to regret it. Because Denmark read other things. He read Exodus 21:16. That said, he that stealeth a man and selleth him shall be put to death. And Revelation 13:10, that said, he that leadeth into captivity shall be led into captivity. Things you don't usually hear in church. You wonder why. And he read about the Haitian Revolution, where Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines in Haiti had a revolution that overthrew the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte to make Haiti the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Things you don't usually hear about in the classrooms. You wonder why. So with all this, you could guess what was on Denmark Vesey's mind. They came up here in 1782, and Captain Vesey needed somebody to do the paperwork. So Captain Vesey would rent Denmark out to do chores for other slave owners in Charleston. And he would split the commission with Denmark. So Denmark was walking down East Bay Street, Charleston, in September 30th, 1799, with money in his pocket, when he heard a barker with a roulette wheel and a crowd surrounding him. And the barker said, hurry, 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 ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, step right up, little bits and numbers, step right up. Round and round she goes. Where she stops, nobody knows. Denmark placed a bet on number 1884 and won $1,500. So he went back to Captain Vesey. Let's see now. I'm working here in my ledger here. And, Denmark, come on in. What can I do for you, old boy? Captain Vesey, I have a question for you. Why, certainly. What is it? Sir, how much am I worth? How much are you worth? Well, let me look in this ledger here. Let's see. How much? Oh, here it is. According to this, you're worth $600. Why do you ask? Diggity, 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 diggity. Okay, I'm worth $600. Here's 8. See ya. Hey, wait a minute, Denmark. Have a nice day. So Captain Vesey took Denmark to the courthouse, which ruled on December 31st, 1799, that Denmark Vesey was thenceforward and forever free. So he became a lay minister at the Hempstead AME Church on Charleston's east side. In the AME Church, we call them class leaders. And while he was doing that, he secretly gathered a corps of followers to form the Great Slave Rebellion of 1822. The plan was they were going to break into the city armory late at night, which is now the federal courthouse, and steal guns. And they were going to go throughout Charleston, freeing or setting fires. And when the slave masters came to put them out, pow, 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 pow. Then they would go throughout Charleston, freeing black people. And he would lead them down to Charleston Harbor, where they would take the guns and hijack ships and sail to Haiti, where they would be free. But Denmark warned his followers, do not tear those who get old coats from the slave master. Do not tear the favored few. And above all, do not tell house slaves. And why is that, ladies and gentlemen? They run their mouths. They eat that cheese. They go Mickey on them. And sure enough, on June the 16th, 1822, May 25th, 1822, one of Denmark's followers, William Paul, was on the corner of Broad on East Bay when he ran into a house slave. His name was Peter Prelude, and he was owned by Captain John Prelude. He said, "Hey, Peter, what's going on?" "Well, yes, sir, Mr. Paul. How is you, boss?" "Oh, I'm all right, Peter. Hey, Peter, look here for me, man. You want to get down with what Denmark Vesey is trying to do?" "Denmark Vesey? Well, who that?" "Shh. So now, Peter, see, here's our plan. We're going to Oh, wait a minute now. You gonna do all of that? Peter, wait a minute now. Peter, don't fail me now. Hey, Peter, wait. Peter ran back to his owner, Captain John Prelude. Mr. Prelude, Mr. Prelude, Mr. Prelude. Oh, my goodness, Peter. What do you mean by waking me up at this ungodly hour? Do you realize what time it is and what's the matter? You're shaking like a leaf on a tree. Mr. Prelude, guess what Mr. Denmark Vesey's going to do? Guess what he's going to do? He is? Oh, my goodness. Heavens to Murgatroyd. This is outrageous, atrocious, and it's pretty bad, too. I must call out the militia expeditiously and right now. So he called out the militia. And called the militia. And Vesey and 34 of his comrades were captured on June 16, 1822. And the court ruled that on July 2nd, 1822, Denmark Vesey and his followers would hang by the neck until dead. And Peter was fat and happy. The state of South Carolina gave him a stipend for the rest of his life for his treachery. He never had to work another day in his life again. But elsewhere in Charleston was a free and educated black man named Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne. He had a school on Tradd Street for free and enslaved children. And because Denmark Vesey used the Bible and history books and the Constitution to encourage revolution, the state of South Carolina made it illegal to teach an African American to read and write. So they shut down his school. But he didn't let that stop him. He went to Xenia, Ohio, where he started Wilberforce College, the first black college in America that was run by black people. And one of his graduates was Bishop Richard Harvey King. Bishop King came down here in 1865 and took what was left of the Hempstead AME Church and built a new church on 110 Calhoun Street that he named after the Hebrew word for God is with us. And it would be the mother of the new black churches in Charleston. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how Mother Emanuel AME Church came into being. Now, I'm not done yet. And that church has made a lot of history because the great educator Booker T. Washington spoke there in 1901. The great poet Paul Laurence Dunbar spoke there in 1904. Martin Luther King spoke there April 12, 1962. Cory Booker, the senator, he spoke there in 2019. And after he was finished speaking, I said, Senator, do you realize you were just in the same pulpit as Booker T. Washington, Paul Laurence Dunbar, and Martin Luther King? And he, as big as green eyes got big, I was? Really? And I said, Senator, don't cry on me now, okay? And he was getting really emotional. And 3 weeks ago, President Biden was there, and I was there in the audience during that message. But unfortunately, the church is best known for the horrible fact that on June the 17th, 2015, the terrorist Dylan Roof entered Mother Emanuel and assassinated among them two people who were very dear friends of mine, the Reverend Clemente Pinckney and the librarian Cynthia Hurd, among the 9 who were massacred. And Dylan Roof was tried at the Julius Wade T. Waring Judicial Center, which ironically was the very same building where those 76 blacks and 48 whites tried to create a better South Carolina in 1868. And today he is at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, awaiting his execution. However, a couple of days after this happened, some of you might have been there for this, 10,000 of us marched in front of the church to show the world that we were not afraid to go back into the church. And while we were out there clapping our hands and singing our songs, the Jewish community of Charleston marched in front of the church and formed a circle and recited the Hebrew prayer of the dead to show solidarity with us. So 3 years later, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Tree of Life Synagogue met the same fate as Mother Emanuel. So that Friday night, a bunch of us went to the synagogue on Hazel Street during their Friday night Shabbat services to return that favor of fellowship and unity in a time of need. And many of you also know that President Obama came here during that time period, and he made history when, during the midst of his eulogy for the Reverend Pinckney, he went off script and gave his rendition of My name is Damon Ford, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.
Thank y'all so much. This is the first speaker of the series that'll be throughout the entire month. As you see, this is a dynamic speaker. I am John Wright. I am the president of the African American Historic Settlement Commission. We are the organization that is doing this Black History Month on Boone Hall Plantation.